Welcome to Polyglot Podcast. I'm Christian from Finland, and today in this episode we have David and Jessie. Welcome to the episode. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm David Peterson, and I'm best known as the language creator for HBO's Game of Thrones, where I created the Dothraki and High Valyrian languages. I've also worked on a bunch of other things, including Defiance, The Witcher, Shadow and Bone. Many of those things I've worked on with my fiance Jessie, including the upcoming Dune film, Shadow and Bone as well, Witcher spinoff that's coming at some point, and Elemental, the Pixar film.
And I'm Jessie, and I also create languages now full-time. I used to be a linguistics professor and now work with David full-time. And other things we had worked on, Vampire Academy and Motherland, Fort Salem. They won't have made as big of a splash since they didn't last as long, but a lot of fun to work on those shows.
Mm-hmm.
And you both are Americans, or?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Before going into detail into all those interesting things that you said, I want to ask, I want to know how you met each other, and maybe about your childhood. So, what are your hometowns? Are you from the same hometown, or?
No. I'm from a very small place in rural Missouri. Population 600, kind of small. So grew up in the woods, grew up in a very, very small area. I didn't even know what linguistics was until I went to college and took a class there. And from there, yeah. So I don't know what to say specifically about my childhood. I guess of relevance to this particular podcast is I definitely did not have any other language inputs other than English, even though I desperately wanted to learn other languages. So I attempted to, teach myself Spanish, which failed miserably because turns out you need to know how things are pronounced. You can't just read a book and learn a language. So, I had tried some on my own. In high school, I took a couple of years of German because that's all my school offered. They only offered Spanish and German, and only for 2 years each. And so I took a couple years of German, and I continued that language study in college, and I was able to live in Germany for a year. So that was a really cool experience. But yeah, always been fascinated by languages, even though I didn't necessarily have access to them.
And at what age did you start your first foreign language? That was in high school, right?
In high school, that was my first foreign language class. I was about 10 when I attempted to teach myself Spanish, but again, failed miserably.
How did you try?
I had a textbook and a dictionary, and I was an intrepid 10-year-old who tried to use a textbook and a dictionary to learn the language, but I didn't know how to pronounce anything. It's kind of problematic.
Yeah. And did your parents or grandparents speak any other languages than English?
No. So very monolingual surroundings.
What about David?
I was born in Long Beach, which is a city in Los Angeles County, and then grew up for the early part of my life in San Pedro, and then moved to Orange County. So all of these are places in Southern California, all of them very urban or suburban. So I've always lived in big cities all my life. And especially diverse areas. Here, hold on a minute. Very sorry. My mother's family is from Mexico. My father's family was not. They were from different parts of Sweden and Germany going way back, but I never had any contact with my father's family. So the only family that I had growing up was my mother's family from Mexico. And I grew up speaking Spanish from a very young age. But then my contact with my family was cut off when my stepfather moved me and my mother away. and didn't allow us to have contact with her family or friends for a couple years. This was when I was 5 or 6, and so it interrupted my my acquisition of Spanish, my natural acquisition of Spanish. I did spend an interesting year in Fresno, though, where I was exposed to Armenian. It's my
Armenian.
my stepfather's family was Armenian. His parents, because he was older, 30 years older, and his parents, both of them, were still alive at that time. And they escaped the Turkish genocide and came directly to Fresno in the United States, because there was and there is a large Armenian community in Fresno. And in fact, we would go to the Armenian church there every Sunday, where the sermon was in Armenian. So that was an interesting and unique experience that I probably didn't appreciate at 5. But anyway, then we moved back, and I was reintegrated into the family. I couldn't, I just couldn't understand Spanish as well. I couldn't keep up. And so I was very frustrated by second languages. And so I didn't really have any interest in them until my second to last year of high school, when I became very interested just suddenly overnight. And so I started to teach myself French, and then I started taking German my last year in high school. I also started studying Latin on my own. And that was when I started acquiring language books very early on. I acquired a very poor quality Vietnamese dictionary.
Yeah.
Because the area that we live in right now, it is kind of there's like it's kind of like a third Caucasian, a third Mexican, a third Asian, in particular Vietnamese and Korean. And so you grow up seeing and hearing Korean and Vietnamese especially, and then also occasionally Chinese, Japanese, and like Cambodian. But anyway, and so if you've seen how Vietnamese is written, there are lots of different diacritic marks. And so when the print quality is poor,
oh my God.
and it's like, oh, like it's like if it's English and it's like, oh, if you see it an I without a dot, it's like, oh, whatever, what else could it be? But with Vietnamese, it's rather crucial. And so but yeah, so then when I got to college, I started studying.
Which decade is this? I think it's important to know, because
good idea. So we were both born in 1981.
Yeah.
So we were born in 1981, about 5 months apart.
Yeah.
Both of us graduated high school in 1999.
Mhm.
So we both went to undergrad from 1999 to 2003. I went to UC Berkeley, where there was a lot of language offerings. So in my first year, I took Arabic for 2 semesters, and then I took Russian, and then I saw that Esperanto was offered. I took that as well. I also took French eventually, and I took Middle Egyptian, the language written in hieroglyphs. And I would have, and perhaps should have, taken many, many more languages, because there were so many offerings, easily 50 or 60 different languages, some of them quite rare. But
wait, this was in Berkeley University or
yes.
college?
No, University of California, Berkeley.
Oh, yeah.
Berkeley College is a music school on the East Coast. Right. So I didn't take more languages, though, because I added a second major, which was linguistics. I did it based on prompting from my mother. I didn't know what linguistics was. But I found it very fascinating and also very easy. And so I added it as a second major, and then I didn't have as much room for languages anymore, which is a shame. But I mean, linguistics did well by me.
And after graduating, you can both comment the time timeline between graduating and before like meeting each other, and then maybe after that you both can talk about how you met and how you started creating all those constructed languages in these different shows.
Well,
Well,
one thing not to skip though during
yeah.
your undergraduate career is your language learning experience.
Oh, because I took,
Yeah.
well, I also took quite a few languages, not as many as David. Well, I was an undergraduate student, and so I actually started taking Latin. I was always fascinated by that, and I started with that. Then I went back to German, and while I was in Germany, I studied Mandarin Chinese and Arabic. And
Why did you live in Germany?
I lived in Trier, and I went to the university there for a year. So I did, an exchange program.
This was so fascinating to me. She took Arabic and Chinese in Germany in German.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So like anytime that they were explaining things, the way that, you explain something to somebody who's learning a language, it was in German, a second language.
I think that actually very much helped.
So your German was
created.
So your
What's
German
that?
was quite advanced at the time when you
yeah, I had at that point taken a lot of German and done a lot of immersion activities to get ready for it. And then during that year, my German became obviously much better because I lived life in German. So yeah, and I think the learning languages through German actually sort of opened up pathways, because when you're listening to something being explained in a second language in terms of like grammar or, different idioms and phrases. Well, for one, it was teaching me new German idioms that I did not have exposure to. And so everybody in the class would be like, oh, yeah, that's what that means. And I would, be the one person like, wait, what? And they were very common things that you just don't necessarily get in a classroom. And so that was very helpful. But then also, like I said, actually hearing it explained in German, it kind of felt like it created different pathways of language learning, where I feel like I learned Chinese faster than I otherwise would have, because I was thinking in German, which kind of removed it from like trying to force everything into an English interpretation in a weird way. So yeah, it was a really cool experience. And it also, as an exchange student, sometimes what happens is you get put in classrooms where the main language is your language, especially if you're an English speaker, because so many, for instance, linguistics courses were offered in English, not in German. Also, when you're tagged as an exchange student, you tend to be placed in classes where, you're with other exchange students and the common language is English. And so a lot of the people who were kind of in the same program I was did not have the same sort of German exposure that I was able to get in the classroom, because I was, for instance, the only English speaking American student in my Mandarin Chinese class. And so it helped me develop a community with German speakers, and it really helped me get a lot more exposure to the immersion aspect of it. Because I found that in general with traveling, anytime I do learn a language and travel somewhere, it can be difficult, especially if it's a country where a lot of people speak English and speak English well. They hear my accent and immediately switch to English. And part of that is like they're excited to practice English sometimes. And, part of it is my language skills are so poor at the time that, they're just like, no, let's just switch over to a language I have a better command of. But it can be really difficult when your goal is, I know I speak like a 4-year-old. I need help. And so, that was undergrad.
Yep.
Then we both went to graduate school.
Oh, she was at Boulder, by the way, University of Colorado, Boulder.
For graduate school, not for undergrad.
For undergrad, you were at Truman State. Excuse me. I don't even know what I was thinking. So she was in Missouri for undergrad. I was in Berkeley, which is in Northern California near San Francisco.
Yeah.
And then for graduate school, I went to University of Colorado at Boulder. And while getting my PhD in linguistics there, I studied, I finally took a Spanish class, took a couple Spanish courses, ancient Greek, because I've
Really?
always been fascinated. Oh yeah, I took a year of ancient Greek while I was there.
I didn't know that.
Wow.
Wow.
They let me audit the class.
Wow. Oh, that's cool.
And I think, oh, and I eventually took American Sign Language as well. But anyway, all that is to say, I continued studying languages while getting my PhD. And then that leads me to 2009. I started my career as a professor. So I had finished my PhD in December 2008, and I started working 2009 as a professor in Texas.
Yeah. In which school or university?
Stephen F. Austin State University. It's in a small town called Nacogdoches, Texas.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not even really near anything. It's like halfway in between Dallas and Houston. I was thinking for an international audience to like place it.
And it also doesn't help. Well, I guess for an international audience, that Houston is the closest city, and
Yeah.
so like that's the easiest way to sort of say which side of Texas it's on, because it's Texas is a big state, and so it's north of Houston, over on that side of the state. But for people who know states well, it's close to the Louisiana border, so it's
Right.
way over on the east side.
And
But
then you worked there until you met David.
Well, long after I met David, actually, because I met David in 2013 at the Language Creation Conference that was held in Austin, Texas that year. It bounces around every time it's held. And that year it was in Austin. And so I took some of my students to the conference, students of my Invented Languages class, where I was teaching them to create languages. And so that's where I met David, was at that conference in 2013. We kept in touch, and after that, every time I offered my Invented Languages class, which was every odd spring semester, so 2015, 17, and so on, David came out to my university and gave a talk and worked with students and things like that. And so, yeah, we kept in touch, and it was the first time we actually worked together was in 2019. And that was the first time he was able to hire an assistant for a project. And so I started as his assistant on Motherland Fort Salem. But then we enjoyed working together so much that we made it permanent and made it a partnership instead of an assistantship.
and that started that started in 2019.
2019, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe now David can tell your part of the story, like until 2019.
Yeah, I went to graduate school at UC San Diego, which is San Diego south of Los Angeles. I never really had any plans to go to graduate school, or any wish to go to graduate school. I was there primarily because I didn't have anything else to do, and I just wanted to, I don't know, just do some school, and linguistics was really up my alley, and I found it very easy, and so I thought I would just continue doing that for a while. And while I was there, I also took American Sign Language, which was a really wonderful experience. I had a lot of wonderful experiences at UC San Diego, and one of them was meeting David Perlmutter, who for those that are outside of linguistics, probably the only linguist you've heard of is Noam Chomsky. If you get into linguistics a little bit, there's like, kind of a second, tier of linguists that you may have heard of. And among them are like George Lakoff and David Perlmutter, and Peter Ladefoged from UCLA. But David Perlmutter, he did a lot of work on syntax, early in his career. But at this stage in his career, kind of the later stage of his career, he discovered, the phonology and the syntax and the various aspects of sign languages, which even at that time, we're talking about the 1980s, maybe even 90s, were still not very well represented in linguistics. They weren't studied very much. And so he made it his mission to study American Sign Language and also international sign languages and discuss them more. One of the things that he did was he created a course, an undergraduate course, and it's like from the academic side of it. I think they look at courses a little differently. I think, like, certainly as a student, I was like, well, okay, I'm getting through all these, general education courses to get to the real courses, the specialized courses, the upper division courses. From a department standpoint, they love these gigantic introductory courses because, you get certain perks where you have a bigger enrollment. And one of the ways you can get a bigger enrollment is having a very popular lower division class that a lot of people get into. And with linguistics, I mean, their best one is usually Introduction to Linguistics, which some people will get and some people won't. And so when linguistics can find a big class that people are really interested in, it's a huge boon. And so David Perlmutter created this course called Sign Language and Deaf Culture that he managed to get put on like the requirements for pre-med and a couple of other bigger departments. And so he was able to put on this course on the linguistics of sign languages, an undergraduate course that had 300 some students. So it was a huge deal. It was like he had 3 teaching assistants because he needed that many teaching assistants. And so I was the teaching assistant for 2 years. And, as part of my background, I wanted to study American Sign Language. So I took it at a nearby junior college. And that was actually really fun because I was a graduate student and I wasn't really like enrolled at the junior college. So when it came to like tests and things like that, I just skipped them. It was like there was a final paper. I was like, that's okay. So I would have gotten like a massive, F in the class, but I was there to learn, and I did. So that was a really, really wonderful experience. Anyway, I also just studied languages on my own, picked up language books and learned them from that. I taught community college for a couple of years after graduate school. After I left, I got a master's and left. I taught English composition, just writing, because that was my main focus in college. And then I did nothing for a year and was very fortunate that there was an opportunity to compete to create the Dothraki language for HBO's Game of Thrones.
Oh, they had a competition.
Yes. And I'd kind of glossed over this, but I've been creating languages since 2000. I started in college when I started linguistics. So I competed in that competition in the summer of 2009, and I won. From there,
how many participants were there?
Around 40. There probably would have and should have been more, but there were a lot of language creators who didn't take it seriously. And I don't blame them because television shows and movies at that time, they didn't hire language creators to create languages. They hired random people or linguists. They didn't hire some people who specifically created languages to create languages. This was the first time. And so for that reason, a lot of people saw the posting and thought, wow, this is made up. This isn't real. This isn't for anything. But yeah, there were some really good people who were part of the competition, including John Quijada, a good friend of mine, whose language exploits were written up in the New Yorker, and Mark Rosenfelder, who is very well known in the language creation community and has written a book. Also, Sonia Lang, who created Toki Pona. All of them were in the competition, as well as other people who are very well known within the community, but wouldn't be known otherwise. Anyway, so I won that. Game of Thrones came out. It was a huge hit. And so I started to be hired to work on other shows and then movies. And basically the career I had just kept building and building.
Can you tell more about how you created the Dothraki language? How long did it take, and how much information, like how much grammar and vocabulary did you create for it, for the competition? And did you then after that create more when you were hired?
So when it comes to creating a language, it's best to have like between 6 months and a year to do it. And if we're working on our own, that's about how long we take. For the competition was divided into 2 rounds. The first round was judged by other language creators, and then the second round was judged by the producers. And we had about 2 weeks for the first round. And then there was a little bit of time that was taken for judging. And then we had another 2 weeks or so, like maybe it was 2.5 weeks each time for the second round. So in terms of how long it took how long I was given. So like the first part, it took 2.5 weeks, or so until the judging.
Yeah. And
then after that was another 2.5 weeks. It really was an extraordinarily short amount of time. By the end of the competition, so the end of both rounds, I had the full grammar. There were really very few things that hadn't been worked out by that point. And I had over 300 pages of material, including the dictionary, reference grammar, and then also translations and things like that, supplementary materials. And the word count at that time was, I think, at about 1,700. So for that first round, or that for the competition. After that, when I got the job, I continued to work on the language. I was working on that primarily, taking all of my other personal projects and kind of put them aside. And so let me think. So I mean, I continued working on it. I think maybe there wasn't much required for the second season, but at this point in time, Dothraki has slightly over 4,000 words, which is a good amount. But for, I don't know, maybe those who listen to this will know this, but like if you take a language course of study at a college and you go from the very beginning to the very end, by the end of it, you have a vocabulary of between 8,000 and 10,000 words for the language that you studied as a second language. So that should give you an idea about, like, for a language to be have a really good amount of vocabulary, assuming that, of course, you handpick, because you can also create a bunch of words that are useless or that would have very narrow applicability. I think a good conlang should have between like 8,000 and 10,000 words. But like Dothraki is my largest language in terms of vocabulary size, and it stands at about 4,000. Very difficult to create words that are a priori, meaning they're created just brand new, as opposed to, like, if you're creating something like Esperanto, I mean, you just open up a dictionary and just change all the endings to O and A and you're good. And then of course also Dothraki, like, for anybody who's not seen Game of Thrones, it's a fantasy show that takes place in a kind of fake medieval era. And so, like, even when during interviews we get questions like, it's like, so can you use Dothraki to go to a restaurant and order? It's like, no, because there weren't restaurants like that, at least not for the Dothraki speakers at that time. It's like, can you say what day of the week it is? No, they didn't have names for the days of the week. Like, they didn't have words for cars. They didn't have words for airplanes. So it's like all of this vocabulary is not appropriate for that language. So yeah.
What kind of vocabulary it has mostly then?
Things that make sense for the type of lifestyle that the Dothraki live. It was a nomadic lifestyle. They, arranged themselves in small groups called khalasars, and then they would kind of range for a period of anywhere from like 1 to 3 years out across like wilderness, setting up camps along the way, hunting and so on. Their level of technology was a little bit lower than I think the rest of the world, or like what was considered state of the art. They would, so they would find, other cities, medieval cities, they might raid them or trade with them. They only had one city themselves that was kind of modeled on Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, that just had where different people would come, and it was almost like less like a city and more like a not a flea market, that's the wrong word, but like
a trading post or something.
Yeah, like a trading post, or like a permanent carnival or festival, where it's like you might come and maybe these people will be here this time, but they won't be here the next time. Maybe somebody else will be, that type of a thing. Anyway, so it's like they have the vocabulary that supports this type of lifestyle. Lots of words for animals, plants, and then of course, vocabulary for the human experience that's common to all of us, emotions that we feel, activities that we do, like sleeping and drinking and eating, things like that. But like, for example, like books exist in this universe, but they don't have a writing system when they don't have books. So like they'll borrow a word for it if they need it, but it's not as if they have any kind of literary tradition that's not oral, So it's like within that frame of reference, like, yeah, you can talk about tons of things. But if you talk about like usefulness for modern day, it's like we end up talking a lot about, television shows, travel, email, like videos and things like that, and there's just no vocabulary to support that, and there shouldn't be. It wouldn't make sense.
Which languages influenced the most Dothraki?
So like none really. Like when you're so George R. R. Martin created words in the books, and that was the biggest influence. The shape of the words, the elements of grammar that were present in those few sentences that were in there. That's really what influenced the language. In terms of like, like where I was at as a language creator at that time, even, and where I am now, it's like I don't really think about language influence, or not in any important way. And I think a really fine way to demonstrate that is we have a joint project that's a YouTube series called Langtime Studio, where Jessie and I, we sit together for 2 hours every Thursday, and we create a language, not a whole language. So we do it in seasons. So it's like we keep working on the same language until it kind of reaches a level of doneness. And then we stop and we start a new one. So we're on our 5th language at this point. But it's a long watch if you want to get into it. But it's like, if you want to see like, well, what is it like to create a language? That is it. And there are influences, but sometimes they're languages, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just like what we're working on. Sometimes it's just an idea. Yeah. It's not like we sit down and think, oh, okay, what language are we gonna pull from this time? We don't do. We just create new stuff.
I'm definitely going to include the links like down here in the description. But if you could summarize what's the process like, if you can somehow explain where to start and how it starts.
So the process always Well, usually always
Yeah.
starts in the same place, and that's, you got to start with your smallest pieces, and that's sounds. So you have to have a sound system selected before you can even think about how am I going to put words together, because if you don't have sounds, you can't really make words for a spoken language anyway. And so we start with picking the sounds. When we create languages, we evolve them from older forms. And so it's like, it's the same process that historically happened. If you look back at, say, the history of English, and you see like what English looked like in Middle English stages, go back even further to Old English stages, you can take it back even further to its Germanic roots. And so you can actually see how the language changes in terms of sound, vocabulary, and grammar. And so we kind of emulate that same process in short. And so once we select what sounds will be a part of the system, we also create sound changes that are going to happen. We also have to decide how those sounds are going to come together into units. And so that's part of what's called the phonotactics of a language, where you decide everything from like, how will syllables be structured? And in some languages, syllables are as minimal as only a consonant and vowel are possible. So you can get syllables like ki, ta, bo, but you can't get something like kim or mat. Like you can't have a sound after that vowel. And so they can range from that very minimal structure to something much more complex, where you can get like Georgian. Can you remember that one Georgian word you told me with like, it's got 8? There we go.
It's like, I think it's you plural peel
and that's a single syllable for the language, and it's got something like 8 consonants in a row. And so they can get really, really complex, but you have to decide like how to shape the language, how those sounds are going to come together. And so that honestly takes a lot longer than people realize. So for instance, David was talking about our Langtime Studio, where each season, I think we have somewhere around 35 episodes per season, 30 to 35. And that's, again, each episode is a 2-hour chunk, representing a time frame. So as David said, it's a long watch if you decide to get invested.
Yeah. Oh, and I want to add too, for those wondering, like, we also kind of like, we go a little faster and maybe aren't as complete as we would be otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's
because we know we only get 2 hours on it.
Yeah. But it's like, so even though that seems like a long time, if we were just doing it on our own, it'd be even longer.
Yeah. And I want to say on average, it's the first 7 or 8 episodes are just spent on sound changes, running through, deciding the shapes of the words. And again, like a lot of people are really surprised because, we'll be 16 hours in to this live stream and we still won't have, really words in the language. We'll only have ideas and shapes and the overall sort of structure that we're going to use after that. And so that actually takes a long time.
One quick question before you continue. Do you write the sound? Do you use English orthography or IPA or?
We use IPA to record the sounds in writing. And so, I mean, because it's the most consistent way to do it. Eventually, we also create for our languages, we like to create romanization systems just as an easier way to share with people who don't know the IPA. Also as a way to share when characters are not always rendered the way you want them to as you share digital files. And so, we eventually do come up with a romanization, but it's really dependent on what sounds and what we need to distinguish among groups of sounds in the language, how that romanization looks.
At the end, though, we also create a writing system.
We do at the very end of each season, we create a writing system for the language that's unique to the language and, from scratch. But that's the final step. In between then, once we have the sounds, that's when we start playing with words and making grammar decisions. Because you can't really start that till you have a really solid base for what sounds and how they're going to come together. And you can't really create words without having a grammar in mind. Otherwise, they're just hanging out by themselves, not doing much. So for instance, you could create a word for chair, all fine and good. You can have the sounds, but then it's like, as soon as you want to think about, well, how would I talk about multiple chairs? Does the language distinguish singular and plural and so on? Like, yeah, you have to start making grammar decisions. Those are all under the realm of grammar.
And which ones is it, like the type of the word order, the type of the language, or which are the first ones that first decisions?
Kind of all as a bundle, because we do decide on word order pretty early in terms of, you know, because the overall general word order of the language will help make other pieces fall into place, just understanding where key elements might come given the overall word order. So that comes very early, but then, I mean, that at the same time as you're deciding word order, you also have to decide like how connected all the pieces are going to be in terms of each unit that you create in the language. Because for instance, one of our languages, it's called Wokutiju, and it's for mice. It incorporates a lot of pieces into one word, to the point where you can have, you know, like a sentence that is really just one word in the language, but it's got all these different pieces of information represented on it. And so you can get that extreme to, right now we're working on Hauwolf, which is a language for dogs. And they're very separated, where it's like each unit expresses a different kind of grammatical piece of information. And so you can get that variety, and you have to decide as you create, and most of the languages fall in between those extremes, by the way. But you have to decide sort of all together. Like, you can't just sit down and be like, I'm just going to make this one decision and then use that to create a sentence. You've got to really think through a lot of pieces all together.
Do you have a lot of exceptions in the languages, in the grammar, or?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Like this one we're working on right now. It was a situation where it's like, well, this is how you would express a perfective aspect, where it's like, I am chasing the dog right now versus I should say squirrel. I chased the squirrel yesterday, where you want to indicate that it's complete. And it's like, oh, well, that works for these verbs. But as soon as you put it into this other thing, like, you end up having to use a different construction for, like, I was a squirrel yesterday.
Well, the primary distinction in the perfective is whether the verb is transitive or intransitive, because the transitive perfective derived from a serial verb construction. And so basically you throw another verb directly before the object, and that wouldn't make sense for an intransitive verb. It was like, it made perfect sense for the transitive, where like the word order is verb, subject, object. And so you would have like chase the dog, the squirrel. The dog is chasing the squirrel. But then for the perfective, you have chase dog, catch squirrel. In other words, the dog chased and then caught the squirrel. And that is what originally suggested the grammatical idea of perfectivity. And so then what happened is the word for catch lost its semantic content and retained only its grammatical content. And so it became a perfective. But of course, with an intransitive verb, like the dog is sleeping versus the dog slept, there's no catching, right? And so we did a totally different construction, which was, I think sleep was a bad example. Let's run. Like the dog ran into sleep, right? It was something like that.
Yeah. Like to completion or something.
Yeah. And so we used sleep as the completive for intransitive, and it's not a serial verb construction. It was using a nominalized version of that verb as the goal. So it's like, you know, sleep dog means the dog is sleeping, but sleep dog to, I'm sorry, run dog is running. Run dog to sleep is the dog ran. I mean, you could say sleep dog to sleep, but it's just not helpful for the example.
But yeah, we create a lot of different things like that. There's also exceptions by way of like, well, this is what the plural looks like here, except when the old form ended in a sound that you can no longer see on the modern form, but it affected, and so it comes out looking just very irregular on the modern day, where it's sort of like how in English, you just have to know that mouse becomes mice in the plural. We have things like that, where it's like, you just have to know that this is the plural of this noun, even though it doesn't follow the more predictable system.
Yeah. How do you do the perfective in Finnish? So syödän is I am eating, right? Have I got that right? Syödän.
Syödän.
Is that I'm eating?
Syödän is the passive
It's a
present.
passive.
Yeah. But in colloquial language, syödän, we eat. We are eating.
How do you just say I eat? Is it syödän?
Minä syön.
Syön.
Syön. Oh,
that's
I'm sorry.
Present continuous.
Syön.
Minä olen syömässä.
Okay. And then in the past tense, is it söin?
Söin, yeah, past.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I just want to make sure I had that right. So minä söin. What's something you eat? I don't know. Pulla. So
yeah, pulla.
So I'm hoping that this is right. So you say minä söin pulla is I was eating pulla, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But if you say minä söin pullan,
yes, the whole.
Yeah,
you ate the whole thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one of those small little distinctions. It's a part of Finnish grammar. And like we were actually looking at that right now. That's our current weekly discussion for our viewers, because we have an option to do this with ditransitive verbs. So we're thinking of having a distinction where if you say give the dog, so you'd say give dog mouse muffin, that would be the dog gives the mouse the muffin. However, if you were to say give dog of muffin mouse, it would mean the dog gives the mouse a muffin. And it's a very similar distinction. Anyway, so that's one possibility for what we're looking at. Anyway, so yeah, things like the long story short, yes, exceptions like that come up when we're creating languages all the time.
What do you think is the most difficult thing in creating a language, and maybe also your favorite part?
Goodness. I don't know that there is a most difficult thing, just because it depends so much on the decisions we've made. Where, for instance, in one language, one of our other languages, there's just so much expressed on the verb that I would forget that, like as I'm translating sentences, like I would forget elements that needed to be included. But in another language, it was like we had so many sound changes that are, noun forms were so irregular that like it became really hard to actually use nouns in sentences, because it was just like so much to remember. And if you're not using the system regularly, then it's like easy to forget all these different things. And so it sort of just depends. I think normally a lot of the difficulties come out in translation, where it's like, oh, we don't have a way to do this. And making those decisions where it's like, do we create a way to do that particular thing, or do we reword what we're translating as we're translating it? So like, obviously leaving the original what we want to say, but creating a completely different strategy essentially for getting the same thing done. And so that can be really difficult, I think, because, for instance, in some of our languages, we just don't have adjectives in the same way that we have them in, English or Finnish or other languages. And so every adjective is essentially a small relative clause. And if you were trying to translate a sentence with certain adjectives where the relative clause structure would end up creating confusion, you have to decide, like, how am I going to do this? And so it really depends on the language, but I think it's once you get into a lot more translation, that's where you start seeing whether you've created enough for the system to actually work. And if you haven't, how you're going to fill in those gaps. Otherwise, I think in general, a much more general answer, I think the hardest part of any language creation process is the documentation. I think it's really difficult, especially for creative types, to stop and say, how am I going to explain this, when you really just want to keep creating? And not only how do I explain this, but how do I make enough notes that I can consistently do this myself moving forward with examples and, write a description. And that can be, I think, one of the most difficult parts, because it's like you sort of put a halt on what creativity you had flowing to be a little bit more academic about it, in terms of like just writing out these descriptions that are not always fun to write, not always fun to read, but
Where do you
need
write?
to have them.
What's on paper, Google Docs. So where do you?
Oh,
document?
we use Pages, because we're both Mac users, and so we use Pages, and specifically we like to use Pages in collaborate mode, because then we can each have it open on our computers working on the document at the same time. And it's easier to search at the end of it. It's easier to create a PDF with certain formatting than it is on, say, Google Docs, where formatting is awful.
It works 99% of the time.
Right.
Yesterday we had a problem on the stream.
But it happens. Internet happens. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the harder aspects. My favorite aspect is it's sort of in the lexical generation mode, where I enjoy playing with word shapes to create unique ways in the language that reflect the world that it's meant to be spoken in, to say words. And that's not to say that like every word has to be an interesting one. Sometimes the word chair is just a word that means chair and there's nothing interesting about it. In other languages, it would make sense for, say, stump to mean chair. And you get to play with, like, how might that look? Might there be a word part to change, stump to stump sit, or something like that. And so I don't know, like that for me is a lot of fun, where I get to kind of immerse myself in the world and decide, how do I want these words to look and how might they match the world they're using?
Initially, when I was going to hire an assistant from Motherland Fort Salem, I put out a call, and so I reviewed a number of applications. But I mean, it goes without saying that Jessie was the best. She was kind of in a class of her own. But in particular, one of the things that stood out to me the most was her creativity in terms of lexical generation. That is creating words, which is, oddly enough, one of the areas that you'll see a lot of language creators kind of phone it in on, which is something I find very perplexing. That is, they go through all the work of coming up with like this phonology and this grammatical system, and then they come to the words and they essentially just kind of go to the dictionary or some word list and just write down, here's the word for this, here's the word for this. And I was like, what was even the point of everything that you just did? But yeah, the material that Jessie shared with me, her earlier languages, I mean, that's where she shines. She's so good at that. She is so good at that. And it's the type of thing, it can't be taught. You just have to, part of it is loving it. Because if you don't love it, you're not going to do it. Part of it is effort and part of it is talent, and she just has all of it. I was really, really excited to be able to work with her, because I just knew that together we were going to be able to do better work than either of us could on our own. Well, at least I could.
Yeah. And what is the show called? I think I haven't heard about this. Salem.
Oh, Motherland Fort Salem.
Yeah.
It was a small show. It was on a very small network here called Freeform. You could watch it on Hulu. I have no idea if Hulu is there in Finland. Is Hulu in Finland?
No, I think maybe, but I have heard about it, but there are not that many people using it.
Right,
Yeah.
sure. Well, it was just an American show. It ran for 3 seasons, and it was based on the supposition that witches were real, and that during the Salem witch trials, to save themselves, witches instead agreed to become the military of the United States. And so now it was looking at a modern world where the United States military is just witches.
And well, militaries around the world as well.
That's true, yeah.
Because they do interact with international witches who are also their country's military. And so it's just like, it's a very different take on how militaries might look and operate if witches were in charge. And of course, being sort of in the same vein of a lot of the witch lore that there is, it was mostly women. There were some male witches, but the majority of them are women, and young, because they're all in, like a military academy starting at like 18. And so it was just a show sort of exploring some fantasy kind of themes on that realm. And so it was, I think, for me, it was fun because it was the first show I ever worked on. I thought we had some really cool ideas for how to do the language. And I always was, as a kid, fascinated, sort of morbidly fascinated by the Salem witch trials in the United States, which were in the late 1600s. And so I had researched them quite extensively, actually, on my own beforehand. And so when I found out the show was about essentially witches that came out of that, I was fascinated. I was ready to jump on board.
Yeah, it was, I think by modern standards, I would say it was a very successful show. Like it's not like it had a huge following, but it had 3 seasons and it got to end on its own terms.
Yeah.
And frankly, nowadays that is a rare thing.
Yeah.
So, and it was a good experience working on it. So, I mean, yeah, it's like many people haven't heard of it. Many people, won't hear of it or watch it. But I think it was a very good show. And we were very happy to be on it.
And for you, David, that was the second big job after Game of Thrones, or?
Oh goodness, no.
They were in between a lot of, like, many more.
20 or so. I mean,
yeah.
The biggest ones, I don't know.
From an outsider's perspective, because sometimes it's hard to judge like what the biggest ones were, but ones that I knew that anytime I said these to my students, they knew. So obviously Game of Thrones, but the 100 was a pretty big one that a lot of people watched and really followed. Defiance had its market, and so it's like if you're into sci-fi shows, like that's one that you may have heard of. And then oddly enough, like Shannara Chronicles was big for a moment, for like,
really,
because it was on MTV and students were still kind of watching.
It was because they had Teen Wolf at that time, and then they canceled like all their programming. But like, I think the big ones are like, so like before Motherland Fort Salem, well, I was doing Dune at the same time. That was huge. But
a movie, yeah, I was thinking TV shows, but yeah.
Oh, TV shows.
I know. I mean, any projects, and I think all those are big. I mean, some projects that you got paid and not only doing for your fun.
So yeah, Dune is really big on the list, but then also Thor and Doctor Strange, David worked on. Which as Marvel movies are huge.
Yeah, and we're even bigger back then.
Yeah.
And you created some constructed languages for all those shows. Can you mention a bit about for whom, like which in those shows, like which tribes or which or how much of the language was used in those shows or films? and by
So in terms of like amount, like the show that had the most language in it, and I think that remains true to this day, unfortunately, is Defiance, which was a show on Sci-Fi. I created 4 different languages for that show, and every character spoke at one point in time, either 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And there was music in every episode where I did the lyrics for it. I did writing systems for all 4 of the languages. The writing systems appeared everywhere. Like even in a show that did use quite a bit, like on Game of Thrones, there are entire episodes without any language material. There was barely any scenes in Defiance that didn't have any language material somewhere in there, even if it was just like a slang term that I had come up with that was now used in English. It was absolutely everywhere. So after that, honestly, I would say the next most is this next Dune movie.
Yeah.
In fact, like in terms of just like percentage of created language material, like it's really all over the board. So it's like, yeah, Defiance is first. The Dune movie that we both worked on is probably second. And third after that, in all honesty, is probably this Witcher spinoff.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that was so much. Like
it's always hard from our working point of view because they may ask for a lot more than actually makes it in. And so it's hard to know how much language will actually show up until you see the production. Because
who decides about it? Is it the director or the
director, editor?
The director on a movie. On a show, it's usually comes from the showrunner, but it's also like guided by whatever the writer is doing in that particular episode. Yeah.
But as a for example, we had altogether something like 26 pages of translation that we did for a show called Paper Girls.
Oh.
And half of a line showed up in fuzz on a staticky radio, and that's all that showed up.
Yeah.
But
half of a line, and you had 26
it was about 26 pages of because the way that we do it is we, give the line, we show the translation, we break it down phonetically. So it like really expands, but there were, for example, though, there were entire monologues where we had like a paragraph that this character is supposed to be speaking. And so, like we were translating lines, entire monologues, and at the end of the day, like essentially nothing showed up.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And so that was a little bit heartbreaking, but like, again, just, you don't know. And so why David is saying probably for a lot of these is like, well, we know how much translation we did for the second Dune movie. We don't know how much will show up, but we have reason to believe that actually quite a bit will. So we have reason to believe that one's going to have quite a bit. But for the Witcher spinoff that he had mentioned, we think, but I mean, we did a lot of translation.
Here's the thing.
We'll find out.
It's like, if they're going to make changes that aren't like super, super minor, it would be like, you know what, this isn't working. We're going to do it all in English. Like that's the only possible thing they could do, really. Whereas like a more normal, disappointing, I'd say, way that it usually works is, for example, the language I did for Thor: The Dark World, where I created a language for the Dark Elves. I was really happy with that language. I liked the way it looked and sounded. And I was given what I thought was not a huge amount of lines to translate. And then what happened is somewhere in the production chain, they decided to severely reduce the number of scenes that the Dark Elves were in, and also take away their lines. And so, I don't know, there's like 4 lines left in the entire movie, maybe.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way it usually goes. And not only that, like the characters themselves aren't very interesting. Like all of their backstories were kind of cut. And I think that this is actually a way that goes with a lot of those Marvel movies. They're are things where like you're supposed to be excited about it if you happen to have already read the comics and recognize whatever character that is. And so then when they're on the screen for like 4 seconds, it'd be like, that's that guy. And then that's it, you know. So, you know, that's kind of the usual way it goes.
Were there big teams creating those constructed languages, or were you in some cases the only ones? I mean, I know Game of Thrones had other languages like High Valyrian and some else, but
Yeah.
what about the team sizes and
It was, well, before we started working together, it was just David.
Yeah.
And now it's just the two of us.
Yeah, I created High Valyrian, like everything for Game of Thrones. It was on me.
every
Like,
how many languages does Game of Thrones have? High Valyrian, Dothraki.
Dothraki, High Valyrian, Astapori Valyrian. Myronese Valyrian is actually just a dialect. So Astapori Valyrian and Myronese Valyrian are the same language. They just Myronese Valyrian, you run it through sound changes, basically. So I would count those as just ones, and that's 1, 2, 3. I created a Guermor, a full language for the children of the forest. That was cut.
Didn't you have like what were they, the giants?
The giants, yep. So I guess that's 5 technically. So there are 5 full languages. I created a sketch for the White Walkers that wasn't used, not a full language. I created a sketch for Ashai, and that was also not used. So that's it. Just those 5 languages.
Yeah, so you created themselves, and in some other shows, the two of you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how does it work? Do they pay by? Does it affect how much ends up in the show, or they pay by hour, or just a fixed sum that you have agreed before the show?
Generally a fixed sum for the language, and if it's a television show, then by episode where translation is required. But that doesn't really have any impact in what actually shows up.
Yeah.
But you know what, that part is actually just commensurate for Hollywood. They will often pay for and hire people to do things that don't show up on screen.
Yeah.
I've seen, you know, where there was like there was an actress who was hired for 1 episode of Defiance, and all of her roles were cut, very sadly. And so it's like, you know, she was paid and everything, but she wasn't credited and she never appeared on screen. For Bright, there was going to be a scene that required the use of like a prosthetic baby, and so it's like the art department, you know, they were paid to create this thing and to create the prop, probably a couple different versions of it, to create the whole thing. That scene was just, I don't even think it was filmed. It was tried and then they didn't do it. So yeah, this type of thing happens.
Yeah. And was it the Game of Thrones competition which you won, after which you started getting all those other gigs, or
yes?
Yeah. And what do you think for people who want to get there, like who want to start working in TV shows and films to construct new languages? What would you recommend?
I would recommend getting a different job right now. There's not a worse time to get into Hollywood at any level than right now.
You can mention what's happening there.
Yeah, so the writers went on strike quite a bit ago, and these are the writers this is primarily for television, more so than movies, because it's like usually movies, you're not paid to write them. You write them and then you get paid. These are for people that are hired to write episodes of television shows, which is honestly where I think the bulk of the money is right now, television shows and streaming. And right now the writers are not being paid fairly for their work on streaming, and so they're on strike. So that was one part of it, which is definitely a big deal. But then SAG-AFTRA went on strike as well, which is the primary actors guild. And so right now, both the writers and the actors are on strike. And I think perhaps for viewers right now, you don't really notice much difference. And that's because, I mean, and this is the case for everybody that works in Hollywood. It's like, you know, we have like a bunch of like shows and movies come out, and they're like, and people say, wow, this must be a really big year for you. It's like, no, this means that last year was a really big year for us. And it was, right? But it's like, you know, you have the typically when you work, you have the year where nobody hears anything about you and you're getting paid a lot of money because you're doing a lot of work. Then you have the next year where everybody hears a lot about you, but you maybe are not necessarily making money because you're not doing work. Because when the work comes out, the work has already been done. So right now, like it's been actually a particularly big summer for movies. You know, like the Barbie movie came out, Oppenheimer came out. The people were very excited about this. And so I think it feels like to people who just watch TV and watch movies that nothing has really happened. And I know that the studios are trying to pretend that nothing has really happened. But pretty soon, once things stop coming out, that's when people are going to realize, wait a minute, what happened? And it's because this is the time where we're supposed to be doing work and we're not doing work. And so in terms of like what we do as language creators, a very small percentage of shows will ever need a created language. Most of them don't even have a second language in it. Like, you know, like most shows that are done in English just have English in them the entire time, because there wouldn't even make sense to have anything else. So because of that, it's harder to find work as a language creator than it is to say just find work as, I don't know, an actor or a cinematographer or something like that. Every show needs an actor or cinematographer. Not everyone needs a language creator. The reason that we've been able to string work together is primarily because, you know, Game of Thrones was like right at the beginning of streaming, you know, and so there was a lot more production. There were a lot more shows. And when there's a lot more shows, then the percentage, you know, the 1% of films and shows that need languages, that 1% suddenly represents a huger number. Right now, with very few things in production, that percentage is even smaller. And of course, it also means the industry is less willing to take a risk on somebody that they haven't heard of. And so, in all honesty, the two of us will probably be fine. And we don't need, you know, that much work to make it an okay year. But that also might mean that we have 100% of the jobs because that's all that exists. So like really, really right now is not the time to get into Hollywood.
Yeah.
But what that means is there's always an opportunity. So it's like, first, you know, in terms of just like a job, you need a job, you need to make money, do something, but you use this time to work on your skills, to start, you know, creating languages, to get better at it, to seek feedback, to improve your work. That's what you need to be doing right now. And it's like, you know, what all the writers are doing right now. They're working on their passion projects. You know, the ideas they might have for a pilot, an idea they might have for a movie, the stuff that they wouldn't get paid for anyway. That's what they're working on, you know, so that, you know, when the strike is hopefully resolved in their favor, there might be another boom because suddenly you have all of this new work that writers have got ready that they usually don't work on because they're spending too much time on the jobs that are paying the money, you know.
In average, what's the range? How many projects do you have every year?
Every year.
Goodness.
They kind of overlap. And so it's hard to do it like year to year, but we're usually juggling between 2 and 5 projects at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how long does one project take time usually? Was it the half a year to 1 year that you mentioned? I mean, that was the time to create a complete constructed language, but is it this?
It's hard to say because it really varies, because our work is often smashed into a smaller time frame for a project taking longer. Because, for instance, just as an example, for the Vampire Academy show that it streamed on Peacock, we were originally hired and told we had 3 months to create the language before they started needing translations for the scripts, and they had sent us the scripts, so we knew what we were translating, and so we were supposed to have 3 months. Then we got an email that said, but the art department needs all these things translated in 2 weeks.
Oh.
And so suddenly this 3 month of work time that we thought we had became 2 weeks, because when the art department needs it, we still wanted those to be good translations. We didn't want the art department. And for the art department, I mean, like, they made the props, the costumes, everything you see in the background, and they wanted the language well represented. We wanted the language to be well represented for any viewers who were paying close enough attention to try to work with the language. We wanted it to be good. And so we ended up pushing and getting all that done in 2 weeks, which meant the translations we needed to do for the spoken lines, some of it was already done for the art department because they needed a book that said the same thing as what the actor was saying. And so it's like, well, that translation's already done. And so what we needed to do after that was sort of more like spot translations, where they would randomly send us something and say, hey, can you translate this? So the project was still going and we were still translating, but like we may only get a line or two every other week as they came up, because we did so much work in advance. And so it's like, what it means to be actively working on a project really just means, okay, production is done. They cannot ask for anything more because, voiceovers are done, production's done, filming is done, everything's done for that season or movie. And so that's when we know the project is sort of closed out on our end. But that doesn't mean that what our work time looks like on that project is the same for the whole time. It's usually up front, there's a flurry, a frenzy, if you will, of activity to be ready for all the work. And then it's sort of like as it comes in. But as another, for example, like on another extreme end, we did the bulk of the second Dune movie translations last summer. And yet this whole year, we've still been working on like post-production requests for translations. And so it's like, it's not super consistent or often, like to the point where I'd be like, this is an active project we have, but it's like still enough that we've been doing work on it for over a year now.
Yeah. Like there are times where you're pretty sure you're done and then something else comes in.
Right.
Was Dune published, or is it going to be released in the future?
This is the second one. So the first Dune came out in 2021.
Yes, it was that November or December of 2021.
Yeah, and then
this one's
coming out in 2023 in November.
Yeah. Okay. How does artificial intelligence affect your work, or do you think if it has any effect, or do you think Hollywood might use artificial?
I mean, there are people in Hollywood who are going to use what they use. I know part of what's happening right now with some of the deals with the writers in particular is there are pushes to use AI even for writing.
And acting.
Yeah. And so it's right now that's part of the negotiations and the back and forth discussion going on in Hollywood. And so depending on how that goes, that could shape certain decisions that production companies might make in the future about our work as well. For the two of us, we have no interest in using AI or incorporating it into our work, because the whole point of a language is that it reflects an amount of humanity, and that is not something that AI can do. And furthermore, it's like, I'm just going to put it out there. AI is really bad at linguistics, really bad at understanding language and how languages are used. And so it would honestly end up creating more work for us to try to use AI than if we just did it ourselves, and the product would not be as good, and it definitely would not be as inspired. And so we have no interest in it. That's not to say that there are not people out there who have an idea for a movie and they're like, I'm just going to essentially have AI create gibberish for me. We can't stop that, but they already use gibberish in some productions, and it's, that's just there are going to be people who go that route.
Yeah. So I think you have been creating already like tens of constructed languages by just listening what you have told me. So I was thinking, how do you make sure they are different enough? And when you create these languages, do you usually read the script and think about how the geography and the characters and time period where they live are, and based on that create the language, or how?
Yeah, we want as much background material as anyone is, willing to give us on any project. So whether that's in a lot of meetings with, the people who are creating the show or the movie, or whether that's, here's the full script, or here's the source material that we're using to create a storyline. Like, we definitely want all of that background information. And part of that is because, and David had touched on this in his discussion of Dothraki, when you create a language, you really want to work on creating a set of what we refer to as basic vocabulary. And that is, this is just like, we need a word for this. This is a basic word in the language. And so there's just going to be, we're going to assign the set of sounds to mean this word. But in a language like Dothraki, for instance, it makes sense that they have a basic word for horse. It wouldn't make sense for them to have a basic word for train or something like that, because they don't have trains. And or even book. Let's go even more basic than that, because like book or paper or leaf, or like anything referring to what could be a piece of paper. They probably would borrow that, because as a non-literate society, like, you have no reason to trade in paper and create paper, and it's like it would be very different. So it's like, you do need that kind of background information, because you want the language choices you make to make sense, and for them that would make sense. For other people that we've created languages for, like, if it's a very modern society where a new language just sort of kind of pops up, having a basic root for car would make a lot of sense, because it's something you have in your daily life and you would need a word for it, and it's something you would need to talk about a lot. And so you need to know that information as you create. So yeah, so we take as much as we can get, and we prefer to have the translations as early as possible that we're going to need, because then we target that vocabulary. And so it's, as we're setting up the grammar, as we're setting up these other decisions, the words we actually create can be, really targeted towards the lines we need to translate. And that's important, because it's more efficient on the work side. Because if you need a noun for drape or curtain, then you're going to create one. Whereas if I don't know that I need to write about curtains in the language, then that would be a very low level word, where it's like, I would not think about creating a word for curtain until much later in the creation stage.
I've never created a word for curtain in my entire life.
There we go.
Once.
There we go. But if we were writing a line that said, get out from behind the curtain, suddenly we need to think about it. And so, it's things like that, where it's like, when we sit down and you have a blank slate and they haven't told you what you need to translate yet, we generate vocabulary that makes sense for what we understand of the world. We generate vocabulary to be ready for what we think they may be sending us. But then, 90% of those words will never actually make it in. That's what we did for Minishe, which was the motherland Fort Salem language. As we were waiting for lines from them, we just generated lots of vocabulary to be ready, thinking, if they need these kinds of words, we're ready for it. We're going to have strategies in place. And then they didn't want those words. And so, yeah, it's easier when we know exactly what they want translated, and where to go from there.
What do you think? Do different shows use constructed languages more in worlds where there's less technology, which resemble maybe our medieval times or even earlier? Because I think if I think the constructed languages that I know, which are mostly languages in Game of Thrones and maybe Tolkien's worlds, and I think they are worlds where there isn't that much technology that we have now. Is that just my point of view, or what do you say as professionals?
I think I definitely see why you have that idea, because a lot of fantasy kinds of worlds end up being sort of there are a lot of fantasy worlds that are like a recreation, if you will, of medieval times, but with twists, whether it's like with different types of people or different kinds of things. However, like, for example, like Dune is a hard one to place because they have technology, but it's like
future.
It's totally different technology than we have. And so like the kinds of words that they would have would again be different because their technology is so different than what we have. And so
future.
Yeah, Dave was kind of going through like a past, future,
present, future.
So I think it depends on what you like to watch that would involve some element of fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I would almost say, my goodness, maybe I think most of these are actually going to be future. Like if you just, even this is future, even though it takes place in the present. I mean, this is present. I think if you group present and future together, it's overwhelmingly more than the past. But like, I don't know, future might be, I don't know. Yeah, there are excuses for any of it, for any show. We can be in romantic comedies. I don't know why we're not.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite constructed languages that you have created, or any constructed languages that someone else has created and that you really liked?
Well, in terms of what we've worked on together, this answer will always be a difficult one for me because I'm going to say Miniche because it was our first. That doesn't mean it was our best that we've created together. And it's not even like, it's like if you're trying to rank the language versus the project or whatever. I don't know, but that one's always special because that was our first experience working together. And so that was really exciting. I think in terms of I really like Chicopsa, which David created for the first Dune movie. And then I joined and worked to help him expand the language for the second movie. And it's one of those things where, I mean, most viewers will never know, but there's just a lot of really good hidden tidbits in how we translated words and like ways that we kind of played with ideas that are incorporated into the lines. And I really enjoyed that. And that is the only project where I was starting to have dreams, not in the language, but about the language.
Wow.
And so like I would wake up the next day and like be frantically writing notes down because if you remember, like that one time I was like, oh, this needs to be an idiom in the language. And so anyway, like that was very exciting for me. So I think that one is probably one of my favorites now.
I love the Ajnamuri language that we created for Vampire Academy. And then for Lane Time Studio, I gotta say, this language that we're working on right now is quickly becoming one of my favorites. I think it's really shaping up very well. This is Hauhof, which we mentioned before. I really like how it's coming out. It's been kind of a surprise. And then in terms of languages other people have created, some of my favorites are Doug Ball's Scara, Mia de Sansa's Ea Luna is a favorite of mine. John Quixote's Ithquil is a favorite. Those are some of mine, I think.
As professionals of constructed languages, I wanted to ask, what do you think? What's your opinion about Tolkien's languages? Because I think this is something uh, almost everyone knows, even though they are not into linguistics and constructed languages.
Oh, I think what he was doing was groundbreaking in our field because, well, first of all, he's one of the first people to openly talk about creating languages for fun, not for an auxiliary language like Esperanto, not for some sort of logical language to like organize the world and, you know, have new words for scientific discoveries or whatever. He was just creating languages for fun. And not only for fun, but like one thing that it depends on how big of a Tolkien fan you are, you may not know that he actually created the languages first. Then he wrote the books because he essentially was expanding the world for these speakers. And as he expanded it, he just started writing down their stories. And so the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit are really born out of his love of language and his desire to create these languages. And the world situates them, so to speak. And so it's really groundbreaking. I would love to see, like, if he were able to be a part of the modern Conlang community. That would be so cool to see how he would have grown and changed. But I mean, he was doing this all on his own. He had no feedback, no input, nothing from other conlangers. And so it's like, I would love to see like what he would have done with that kind of community in terms of expanding some of his ideas. I mean, because I mean, some of his work, he's very open about the fact that he's like, well, these sounds are in it because I like them. Like there's absolutely no other reason other than I like them. This language is for me and no one can tell me not to have this sound. And so there are some sort of, I think, inconsistencies that can get built into a linguistic system when you're doing so many choices that are aesthetically driven. But at the same time, he was a very good linguist. And so he had a really good handle on language and how it's used. And so, you know, and also an amazing Anglo-Saxon scholar. He has a good translation of Beowulf. That was probably one of the bigger ones before Seamus Heaney had his even bigger one. But anyway, yeah, so that's my 2 cents.
I thought that was good.
Where can you, what are the main places to find conlangers, like events or online, and how big is the scene?
Well, in terms of conlangers in numbers, there are a lot of conlangers around the world. I have no idea how many there are because not all of them participate in communities. Not all of them even necessarily openly talk about it with friends and family. It's more of like, we just do this in our spare time. But there are people, I mean, it's tens of thousands around the world who play with creating languages. And so there are a lot of people out there. Online communities, I feel like it's difficult because online communities right now are very what I would call decentralized, because it depends on what, social media or what online areas you're already plugged into. And so, for instance, like I don't know how active it is, but there was like a Facebook group, but then if you're not on Facebook, that doesn't help you. There used to be lists on Twitter, but now a lot, if not most people have left Twitter. There are some Discord servers, but again, it depends on whether you're on Discord and you use it and, like how much exposure you have there. So it's like, it's really, I think, difficult to just be able to say, here's where you go to find a community. I think the Language Creation Society, at least they used to have sort of a running list of here are the online communities we know about. I don't know that they still have that on their website, but at one point they were trying to help people plug into communities. In terms of gatherings, there is a language creation conference, the one that we met at in 2013 is still ongoing, but now it's since the pandemic, it's turned into a virtual conference, and so I don't know that it'll ever be in person again. I don't know, but that's every 2 years. And then David and I are hosting what we're calling CopyCon in September next month at Georgetown University, and so we're having people from around the world are going to be joining us at Georgetown for this Conlang conference, and it's going to be featuring an amazing lineup of speakers, including Mark Okrant, who created Klingon, John Quijada, who David has mentioned a few times, Doug Ball, no, not Doug, sorry, Carl Buck. I said the wrong name. I'm so sorry. Carl Buck, who worked with David on Halo, and Sally Caves, and
Paul Frommer, who created the Napi language for Avatar. Yeah.
So yeah.
And there's still like 4 spots if you want. If you want to attend, if you happen to be in Washington D.C., you can go to copycon.com and sign up. But there's we have a limit on the number of attendees that we can have, and I think that there's exactly 4 spots left.
What's the limit?
100. Well, for us, 50, because we're splitting it between Georgetown. But yeah, it's going to be 100 total.
Yeah. Okay. And I think if people know about these events, they can also leave a comment here.
Yeah.
How much are you interested in dead languages? I mean, extinct languages and natural languages compared to con languages, which is in a way your hobby and profession, if you can say so.
Yeah.
I don't know that I can draw a line between them. I'm interested equally in all of them because my work as a conlanger is very much driven by my knowledge base of natural languages and how they work, which is, I get ideas all the time from reading. For fun, I'll just read grammars of languages that I had never even heard of before. Like I was reading a grammar of Limbu the other day, which is a language spoken in Africa. And I just seeing how they did some things, it's like, oh, that would be a really cool thing to, earmark, think about a future construction in another language. And so it's like my interest in natural languages is a big part of what drives my love for creating languages. And natural languages, whether they're still spoken now or are no longer used, I'm fascinated by them all. And so like I mentioned, I studied Latin and ancient Greek at the college level, but like I haven't yet, but I really want to also study like the old Sanskrit and whatnot. But I'm fascinated by them. Whether or not they're spoken today, the only difference is I'm obviously not going to get to practice speaking it if it's no longer spoken today. So like that's a big difference, is like you obviously don't plug into a community for that.
Except for Latin, they have a group of speakers. I know a guy who's fluent in Latin.
But
he gets together every year for that. Like they just speak Latin. It's wild. But yeah.
Much harder to find.
Very more difficult.
And how much do you have currently time to practice like natural languages, or how much do you use natural languages?
I mean, I still use Spanish sometimes with family or just periodically because, we're in the area. But mainly it's our main project is learning Finnish.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why?
A number of reasons, but we're both big fans of Finland. Now I'm really grateful for this. I went to Finland for the first time in 2017. In fact, I'm wearing my shirt, my 2017 shirt.
Yeah.
But this is I was a part of the group that brought the World Science Fiction Convention to Helsinki in 2017, and so I went for that, and it really just changed my life. I fell in love with Helsinki where I visited, and I'd never been anywhere else that I loved more. I really wanted to go back. And so I got us a trip to Finland this year. It was this year.
May.
It was in May. And I was really hoping that Jessie would like it too. And I was just feel so very lucky that she really, really liked it too. But we were there, we were in Helsinki for 4 days, I think. And then we had a mini trip up to Ivalo, where we then drove from there to a very small place called Gilajoka. And that was where I proposed to Jessie, and she accepted. So anyway, so yeah, we just absolutely love it there. And want to go back as many times as possible. Ideally, maybe live there. It'd be nice.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, I would be really happy. Yeah, we're going to move to Rovaniemi, which is in Lapland, like you know.
Ooh,
so
nice.
welcome to Finland.
That's pretty wild, by the way, because like as far as I understand, it's kind of like a destination, right? I've heard a lot of people visit Rovaniemi.
It's probably #1 destination for foreign tourists in winter.
And yeah, so you're going to be living there year round. Like, have you? I mean, I imagine it's much colder there. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, it's not that much colder, but yeah, it can get -35, 40 in winter. And in southern Finland, where I've lived my whole life, I was born in Tampere, but I've lived most of my life in Helsinki, Vantaa, and a few years in Turku and other places. So, but I think southern Finland is a bit boring after almost 3 decades here. And 2019, I actually walked across Finland from Nuorgam to Helsinki, 1,500 kilometers. And the next year I cycled, and I really liked Lapland, that I decided that one day I'm going to move there. And now I'm going to move there with my wife.
That's amazing.
Wow.
That is amazing.
That is,
and it is gorgeous up there, but yeah, that is amazing.
That is a truly impressive feat that I am not jealous of.
No, it was great fun. I got to meet a lot of locals around Finland during that trip.
Yeah, that's really something. I mean, for me, it was enough driving up there.
Yeah. So you drove from Helsinki to Ivalo?
No. We drove from Ivalo. So we flew from Helsinki to Ivalo, and then from Ivalo drove from there to Gilajoka. And then actually from Gilajoka, we went up to Norway. I never remember the name of the city. But it's right on the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah.
It was only an hour and 40 minutes away. So yeah, we've driven up there, but yeah, I can't imagine walking that distance.
Yeah.
or cycling.
Did you start learning Finnish after that trip, or already before?
We started learning before. But you know, it's always difficult when you're learning the language, and it's like basically we got enough under our belts that I felt pretty comfortable, like kind of seeing, you know, like maybe a sign and being like, okay, I know what this is, or being able to say, like, you know, like I love my morning coffee, and so being able to go in and know, like, oh, these are the kinds of words I'm going to see on signs, and like this is what I need to look for what I want. But not good enough that I could necessarily do my whole order in Finnish. And even if I could, not good enough that I'd understand what was said back to me.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, it made it so I felt very comfortable in terms of being able to see and, you know, try to pronounce things. And so, you know, I could attempt my order. Usually the person on the other side switched to English when they heard me attempt Finnish.
But it's good.
But someday I hope to be good enough.
It's good you tried at least.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like the people that we met were very appreciative of our tries, and were very patient with trying to help us learn new words and things.
What do you think in Finnish? What's hard, and are there anything similar structures or elements in the constructed con languages that you've created?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's going to be relationships between any language and any other language, like, and that's constructed or not constructed. I think that the difficult thing for Finnish is really, gosh, I don't think we've gotten there yet, because the difficult thing is the interaction, I think, between the cases and the possessive suffixes. We haven't even seen plurals.
Right.
But
I know for me right now, like I feel like I'm getting better at predicting when to use, for instance, the partitive versus some other case ending, because it is different. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, for this particular word, you're going to use the partitive after own, but only because this is what it's describing, and only because this other thing. And so, yeah, like I know that for me, it has been a little bit hard, but I feel like I'm getting a tiny bit better.
That's exactly what my wife has said here. She's from Ukraine, and she's like learning Finnish, and that's exactly the same. Like partitive still is quite hard, but she's quite good currently. But yeah, David, you were saying something.
I was going to say part of the problem is that Finnish in this aspect specifically behaves a lot less like case languages usually do. So things like Russian and, by extension, actually Ukrainian and Latin, where it's like you expect certain cases based on the verb and on the role in the sentence. And you also expect for like elements to match in case. Whereas Finnish doesn't do that. And it's almost like the cases are less a reflection of the grammatical role in the sentence and are instead more of an active participant in much the way that an article is. And so it's like, it's like in something like Latin, it's like, it's not an instance where it's like, well, okay, if you use this case, it means this. If you use this case, it means that. It's like, this is what you're saying. This is the case. Whereas like in Finnish, it's like you have a choice about the case in some instances, and then it changes the meaning of the sentence. And we're talking the very basic, like partitive versus nominative versus accusative/genitive. That's the thing that is very unfamiliar for people who've studied things like Russian or Latin, and it's kind of bizarre. It's honestly, that's a little bit more like the type of thing you see in English or even German, a little bit, but not with case with article choice. And so that's the thing that I think is difficult. And yeah, so we're doing Duolingo, and it's like that's also, there's not a lot of overt instruction, which can be frustrating, because it's just like you're having to try to figure out what the patterns are, and sometimes it can be quite difficult with no instruction, especially when you're not even sure what the what the relevant pieces are. So it's like in some cases it's like, oh, this has happened because this is actually a mass noun, but there is nothing in there about mass nouns versus count nouns or things like that.
And what about the six locative cases? Was it hard to understand how to?
Those will be easier when we get to them.
We've only seen some of them, and I think the hardest part was for that so far that we've seen is that like tuossa and tuolla are used kind of differently in terms of like,
that's part of an artifact of Duolingo, I think.
Like when something is over there, it's sort of like how you end up saying it. it doesn't fully make sense with that adverb in terms of being able to predict which form is the better one. But I also know that, yeah, it'll be, like once we get to the nouns, I think it'll be a little bit easier because based on the grammars that I have now downloaded and started reading, because I'm like, I can't without knowing why we're doing certain case endings. It's really interesting to see how the verbs will really kind of dictate what the best case will end up being on the noun, rather than like in a lot of languages with locative cases, it's really the noun that dictates which one is the best case ending. Whereas in Finnish, it feels like it's more of like the verb will help indicate what it is going to be the better option. So
yeah, and but that what Jessie just described, like for example, the difference between like tassa and talla, right? This is the exact same thing that you have in other languages, just not with cases. So it's like one of the things that when you're studying French, that very early on, it's like, what do you mean it has to be, en France, but it's like dans when you use it over here. And it's like, they're prepositions and they don't match up with English. Same thing with any language like that. And so that's not as big a deal, to be honest. It's just, well, now they're suffixes as opposed to being prepositions, so it's like, it's frustrating, but it is a familiar type of frustrating, I think. Whereas like the interplay with the nominative part of an accusative is very difficult.
Yeah.
I think we're running out of time soon, but I have two short questions. I think we have around 5 minutes still.
Okay.
So the first one is, would you rather speak perfectly 10 biggest languages of the world or 1,000 smallest ones? And the second question, okay, you can answer now. I'll ask after that, my last one.
1,000 smaller ones.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, 100%.
Which ones?
The 1,000 smaller ones. Yeah.
Okay.
Because that would be amazing to have that kind of grasp on 1,000 languages.
Yeah. Not only that, the amount of resources that are present for the 10 biggest languages, there are just so many resources. And we love learning languages. So it's like, well, we could just tap into all these resources and spend time learning them. For the 1,000 smallest, there might be no resources at all. No chance to learn those languages aside from just going there. Yeah.
Would you still pick if you wouldn't speak any out of those 1,000 smallest ones? I mean, if you would lose also English and the other ones that you speak now.
Interesting. I think that would be really difficult given our current, like we would have to change our life essentially.
Yeah.
So we don't have our jobs. We could not.
Yeah. I mean, we'd have to, if we could make some contacts before the change happened, because like then we could just, kind of like send out a huge announcement to like all of the universities, all the universities' linguistics departments across the world, say, hey, we're about to do this. We're
about to drink our potions.
Yeah, we're going to become fluent speakers of the rarest languages in the entire world. Make sure that we don't have to worry about money for the rest of our lives.
We will be your speakers forevermore.
I think you would maybe find some bilingual English to some small languages like natives.
Yeah. Also. But no, that would definitely be difficult in terms of we would definitely have a lot of changes that would have to be made. Yeah. But at the same time, I guess that would be, we would have to work with our families as well, because if we've lost all ability of speaking English or Spanish, we would definitely have to teach our families.
Yeah. We'd lose German too.
Yeah, we'd lose that too.
What would our languages be that we'd still have that we'd studied? Like probably American Sign Language. Like for me, maybe Russian, Esperanto.
Russian is way too big.
Is it top 10? You think Russian is top 10? Is Russian top 10?
It is, yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, I was gonna say Russian is. I gotta say it's gotta be way up there.
All right, I'm gonna lose Arabic.
Oh, totally, totally. So yeah, it would really be like
you'd lose Chinese.
And if you think about like sitting down to dinner with your family and just having to be like like pointing to things and be like, I got to teach you my words for these because I can no longer grasp English.
We'd still have Finnish.
We would still have Finnish. Helsinki, here we come.
Well, you wouldn't have Finnish because thousand smallest ones are like Finnish is in
I
top
thought,
200.
no, wait. No. You said we would only lose the 10 most.
No.
the 10
I mean, if you choose 1,000 smallest ones, you would only have the 1,000. So number 6,000 to number 7,000.
Oh, so we'd lose even the ones that weren't in the top 10?
Yeah.
That's tough.
Sorry,
This is just a really unfortunate thing. I don't know why.
However, wait, would then like could we still use Finland because the native Sami language?
Yeah, you could. I think
So
some of them.
We would
be
now
there.
speak that, probably.
Yeah. So we could still. Oh, and you would get used to winters up there. It would be fine.
Okay, I think. Yeah, it would. We would need a whole episode to think about this question and all the levels. Like, could you still keep this and that language?
Right.
Yeah, I think so. You have soon a phone call scheduled, or so?
Yeah, I need to get going.
Okay.
What was the other snow question?
I don't know if we have time for that or.
Oh, go ahead and toss it out.
Okay, the last one is: would you rather speak all the languages, but you couldn't read and write at all, or you would not be able to speak, you would understand and read and write all the languages, like even the dead ones?
I would say not read and write because I'm pretty sure we could learn it again.
If you couldn't.
What, like I wouldn't be allowed to?
Yeah.
Your body would just like shut down every time you tried.
Oh, I think we'd have to go with reading and writing then. Our careers are more dependent on reading and writing than speaking, I think.
I'll keep the speaking then. You keep the reading and writing.
There we go.
We'll partner up because, and that pains me because I am a writing person. I want to write things and play with books and things like that. But when you think about how much spoken communication you need on a day-to-day basis, not having that would really be isolating. And so that's tough.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, you have to pair up.
That was a really good discussion, and I think we definitely need to do another one in a few years. Maybe when if you move to Finland, we can do it like live somewhere.
Awesome.
In Lapland. But anyways, thank you for participating, and thanks for all the viewers who listened. I think it was really interesting.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kiitos.
Kiitos teille. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.
Sounds good.
Bye.